brands are not things. They aren't the artifacts. They aren't your identity. They aren't your packaging system. They aren't your environment. They aren't your product. They aren't any of that, right? What brands are is a gut feeling you have about something, right? And when two people have the same gut feeling, you have a brand, right? And that's something that you can't really force. You can't make people feel something, right? You can only influence it.
Robert, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really, really excited to have you here.
Thanks, Ross. I'm happy to be here as well. This is great. Long time coming.
Yes, yes, we've been trying. I'm interested. My first question for you is, this is a podcast sort of unpacking branding, and we've spoken to many different people, and a lot of the stuff they make is experiential or conceptual or anything. And you're the first sort of person who kind of product is the primary expression of brand in your work. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about products as brands or brands expressed as products? I'd love to understand that product designer's point of view.
Yeah. It's a really interesting piece of the work for me, because I, despite what we do being extremely technical and a lot of development work that goes on to bring something out in the world, we spend a lot of our time dwelling in the world of emotions, right? And one of the reasons I got into industrial design is that I became fascinated with this relationship that people have with things, right? That in many ways, we as human beings will define ourselves through the things we acquire, that we wear, that we live in, that we drive, And so we have this interesting relationship with objects, and it tends to be emotional. And there tends to be connectivity with things that sometimes people can articulate and sometimes they can't, right? And so, the way I look at brand in the work that we do is, first of all, what I often say to people is, brands are not things. They aren't the artifacts. They aren't your identity. They aren't your packaging system. They aren't your environment. They aren't your product. They aren't any of that, right? What brands are is a gut feeling you have about something, right? And when two people have the same gut feeling, you have a brand, right? And that's something that you can't really force. You can't make people feel something, right? You can only influence it. So in the world of product design, the way that people interact with things and the feelings they get and what it means to them in their lives is really very much this sort of direct conduit between you, the company, and your audience, right? And so when you can, through a product and its experience and what it does for you, create this sort of charismatic relationship, right? You shrink that gap, right? You become more connected. And that's why, classic examples like Nike and Porsche and BMW, right, have this sort of visceral relationship with their audience because they connect through the products of the company. So that's a sort of long-winded explanation of how we tend to look at brands, right? And it's so much more than having this sort of consistent look and feel that somehow differentiates you from the rest of the world in your own unique way. That's certainly part of it, but it's much more, and it's much deeper.
That's, as you were talking, it sort of reminds me, in South Africa at the moment, we have a flood of Chinese automakers sort of coming into the country, and roll back 6 years, 7 years, all of these cars were cheap, badly made, badly designed kind of knockoffs. Now there's brands like Jetour, which have made the Land Rover Defender, but modernized. So the physical object is now on par, or if not better, than if you were to purchase a German or a Japanese or an American car. And the bit that's missing, I think, that they are desperately trying to sort of win consumers over with, is exactly that feeling. Like, how do they, there's a feeling that Porsche has spent, the last 70 years
Yeah.
sort of instilling in our heads that it's better.
Yeah.
But the difference between a Porsche and a Nissan tangibly is almost nothing, but the experience, the way you feel, the identity you assume when you sort of drive that thing are much different.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, we go back to one of the things that we've worked on extensively. I mean, actually, I just did an audit for 20 years, which is, Beats by Dr. Dre. I mean, a big part of that, right, was this, when that kid invests this money in these headphones and he leaves his dwelling, whatever it is, and puts them around his neck, right? He's transformed, right? He's connected not just to the product, but to the what the product's about, and all the celebrities and athletes and everyone else that's connected with that too, right? There becomes this sort of portal into something else. And that's, when a product is really at its best, is when it does become this portal or window into this broader world that allows you access and gives you these positive feelings. And I said that's for me, it's one of the more fascinating things about the work.
Mm. I mean, I can actually remember the first time I held the Gen 1 pill in my hand, like the feeling of that speaker, the weight of it, the shape of it. And interestingly now, with things like JBL and all of these speakers that have sort of copied that form factor. But I remember at the time it was such a special thing to hold, and the audio that it made was also phenomenal. And it was when you sort of carried that with you, you had a certain feeling that came with it. Like, how did you talk me through the design process of coming up with something like that and making those decisions to create something that sort of stands out so much?
Well, it's that one in particular is funny because I'll get to your more broader answer, but when we started doing the Bluetooth speakers were just beginning to happen, and there was the Jambox, which was by Jawbone, which was relatively successful, and so we decided Beats we wanted to be in that space and began playing around with different form factors and so forth. And one of the things we'll do with Shape is really look for this sort of balance of, of course, functionality and sort of design integrity, but also some sort of iconic nature, right? In some ways, you can create something that can almost be distilled down to a few pixels on a screen, and you would still recognize it. And we just threw out this pill shape, right? And it just it became this, I think Jimmy Iovine said at the time, looked at it and said, that's just what the doctor ordered, right? Sort of this sort of almost joke connection to the idea of Dr. Dre, which we hadn't intended at all, which was really funny. We just sort of came across and I remember, having arguments with Jimmy about the design and him telling me once, look, I know pills really well, right? And so he tell you what that's about. But, to answer your question, the sort of process is, it's long and complicated, but in some ways it's very simple. I mean, we will start out, asking ourselves this question, which is, what's worth designing in the first place? And, because I don't think a lot of people may not realize when you're developing a product, a piece of hardware that's going to be manufactured and delivered into the world, it's a long process. Typically takes 2 to 3 years. There's an enormous amount of people involved. It takes anywhere from 5 to 50, sometimes $100 million to deliver something. Right? There's all this that happens. So you kind of need to figure out what's worth that, right? What's something that's going to really create change, create opportunity, create movement, and so forth. So we spend a lot of time sort of looking at that and trying to answer that question. But then, I have this thing which I think sometimes drives people a little crazy. I sort of, okay, let's take all that information and lock it away somewhere and just do an entire 360-degree look at this thing and what it can it be, right, in all different ways. Because I think many times, what happens is, as humans and designers, you bring these predispositions to something, and those, sort of shape what you're doing. And a lot of times it's right, but a lot of times you miss a lot. So you sort of really force people to get outside themselves. And so we go through the process of creating a variety of ideas, literally, sometimes hundreds, and looking at things in a very different way. And through our working together as a team, those are the things that start to make sense and start to really, resonate as an idea, going to come together. And then we go back and apply that initial what's worth designing in the first place framework onto it, right? And see, okay, all right, yeah, okay, now this works. And then it goes through a process of development. We do a lot of testing, although it's not. I have this sort of love-hate relationship with consumer research. In that I think if you ask people what do they like or what do they want, their framework is very much today and backwards, right? As opposed to looking out ahead and anticipating anything. And in generally, people aren't good at articulating that. They're better at articulating what they don't like. And so, but what we like to do is put things in front of people and see what happens. Can they turn it on? Can they understand it? How do they react to it? What does it make them feel? What does it make them think? And so forth. So we go through a fair amount of research. Finally, focus on one thing, and then it's a long process of figuring out how to actually build that thing and create it in volume and move it out into the world. It's really the industrial design process is truly one of the 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration things in delivering something out.
I can imagine. And then there's all the things that you need to take into account, as in availability of resources. And I guess if you're designing technology that's only going to be on the shelf in 3 years' time, how do you make sure that certain components are even relevant by the time they reach the shelf, because the stuff advances at such a rapid rate? It's also a fascinating thing.
It's endless: materials, safety, reliability, supply chain, all this kind of stuff, right? That you're just trying to make sure you've designed this thing, and now you have to, turn on a switch that you're going to be able to make whatever 100,000 of them a month. That will happen, and not go out into the world and blow up, right? So it's a very sort of long, drawn out, detailed process.
There've been a couple of sort of public product failures and recalls in the not too distant past that we cannot talk about. I'm interested in going back to that, what's worth designing, because, there's, I think in a lot of the work, and maybe I'm reading into it, that I see you guys do, there's often sort of underlying meaning, or, there's something deeper to the item than just the having a beautiful form and a beautiful thing. There's often a little bit of story or something in there. Am I reading that correctly, or is that?
Yeah, it is, and it's something that's really important to me. Is that it is a form of storytelling. It's a different form of storytelling. And actually, what the moment that became clear to me was actually when I was a student, and one of my inspirations when I was in school was the architect and designer Mario Bellini, who had done this amazing work for Olivetti in the late 70s, which really, in many ways, if you go back and look at it, it was the foundation of technology design. Right? So I went to see a lecture by Bellini, and he's sitting on the stage in one of his Vitra chairs he designed. And he had two slide projectors, 35mm slide projectors, sequenced together, big screen. And on one side would be an image, an abstract image, or something in nature, or it's a sort of very emotional picture. And then on the other side would be a product or a detail, right? And the one I remember, he showed the profile of a great white shark, and then the profile of the BMW 633 CSI, and you could see the shape, right? Or this sort of sensual form and knob detail in a product, and then a sort of cropped shot of a breast, a human breast. I mean, all these sort of relationships of, emotional images with these products, and you could just see how that imagery was connecting together. And when when you saw that car, right, it had this sort of aggressive, fast moving sort of feeling, and that's where this connectivity was happening. And so there is a story to tell. And one of the things I also loved about Bellini's work is everything always seemed to be in motion, right? It seemed that it was moving, or it had just landed, or was getting ready to take off, right? And there was almost a little bit of discomfort in looking at this thing, right? Because it's just a slight bit of like, what's it going to do next, right? And so, so I began intrigued by, this, again, relationship with things, but what are the stories that they're telling people, and how, and stories that, of course, people make their own stories, but then there are things that they're drawing from everything that they've experienced all through their life, and see, that are representative for them in this thing. And then there's a story around what it does and how it does it, and how it behaves when it does it, and how it behaves when you're using it, and what is the story you're getting there, right? And so that's it. And it's really fascinating because it's not something that people almost many times don't even realize is occurring, when they're interacting with something physical, but it's there, right? And as a designer, you hope that you can create these stories that resonate positively with people and draw upon, again, emotions and experiences that are beneficial and joyful, and that's part of this aspect of creating stories in the product.
And how much do those stories tie back to the brand narrative or the purpose or the expression that they're trying to get across? Like, how closely do you try and weave these things together?
Yeah, definitely. And there is sort of an envelope that envelope may not be a right word because it's a little constraining, but there is sort of a field, an energy field you're working in, right? When you're working with a brand that is established, or sometimes, we do a lot of work with startups who are actually creating something new and kind of cognizant of what is this sort of energy field that we're creating with the products and the brand. And, and again, back to Beats for an example, there has always been, a sort of slightly countercultural aspect, in your face aspect, very sort of brave, kind of proud sort of aspect of the brand, which we're always trying to connect into the products, right? To not, to not hold back, of course, doing things that are well designed and tasteful and have longevity, but at the same time feel like they're not afraid to take a position and not afraid to be recognizable and be iconic and so forth. So those are sort of an example of what you're working in, and it's, yes, you can be very literal. Sometimes we do that as sort of really sort of identifying, something with a company and a brand, and very sort of literally embodying it, and then sometimes it can be just sort of, there's an attitude and a spirit that this company authentically communicates, and you're leveraging and embodying that in the product and how it appears and feels and operates.
I mean, I've got this sort of visceral memory. My father had one of those. Do you remember the multi-stack hi-fi that was super popular in the 80s? He had the double tape deck and the radio, and then the mixer, and then the volume thing, and then the record player on top, and the big sort of matching speakers. It was by a Japanese brand called Iowa. And it had this volume knob right in the middle, which had a ring light around the back. And there was a tactile feel when you turned the volume up. There was a slight clicking, but it had been rounded off, so it wasn't a harsh clicking. It was a very soft clicking, but it was the most satisfying feeling. And I could remember, it's like the the hero of this thing is the volume knob. So whoever designed that was telling this story that this is about, this is about the audio that comes out of it. And I can actually remember as a child sitting there just playing with that knob for hours just to experience the feeling of it.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's actually. I'm glad you brought that up because there is an aspect, and we talked a little bit about it before. The sort of tactility of things, right? And sometimes the development teams we work with don't understand why we're so maniacal about it, right? And getting to a certain specific texture and a certain specific finish and a certain weight and so forth. And because it's really interesting when you touch or pick something up, there's a lot of information that's coming through that, right? And again, you may not realize it, but you how that feels is telling you something. And again, if you've experienced something that's very quality before and it has a certain feel, and you get something you haven't experienced before and it has remnants of that quality feel, it's all of a sudden all these messages come through are positive. So we'll obsess a lot about that and just trying to get that just right, because it's the tolerance is very narrow, right? Very gay, in terms of getting that right feeling. You can be off a little bit and completely miss it. So it is again a bit of an obsession on our part to get that click just right, or that texture on the knob just right, or the dampening, a little bit of resistance that's there when you turn it, right? All those things are communicating to you something about the product.
And it's amazing if you get that right, how long a product can last. If you nail that feeling and that texture and that selection of materials, there's the Technics record player that all the DJs want, that's now sort of 25 years old, and there's infinitely better technology around, but that is the one that everybody wants. It's the one that they designed the best. It's the one that's kind of stuck through there, and they still get to make it all these years later. So I guess it's that when you get it right, the opportunity for the brand and the company extends. It extends the shelf life of the desirability of the product exponentially.
Yeah. No, it's a chance. I just recently got an email inquiry from a company that is one of these sort of organizations that's collected a bunch of brands and bought brands of the past, and they just had acquired the Nakamichi brand. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Nakamichi. It was the classic audio brand, popular in the 70s, and I don't think it's going to work out, but I immediately got excited about this notion of, that sort of translating that into something modern, and that people could, but still get that same kind of vibe out of it. So it's great.
It plays so well with the trends of today, like the sort of looking back and the nostalgia that's sort of so prevalent right now. I think that would work so well.
Yeah.
So I mean, you've talked a bit about these details, right, and how you obsess about them. Why do you think they matter? Because we experience this a lot. Like the team will be obsessing about getting the color right in print, and we'd go through like 50 different iterations to make sure that it's exactly the hue that they want. And the clients are like, just give me my colors. Like, I don't care. I want it. Like, it has to happen. Like, how do you argue for the details? How do you argue for the time and the investment? And if there was somebody who owned a brand who was coming to an industrial designer, like, how would you advise them to approach that relationship in a more productive way?
Yeah, it is really tricky at times, and I am, very cognizant and empathetic around. Like, we're trying to get something out into market in this time frame. We need it to cost this much. All the things that sort of have been defined in terms of what we need to deliver on, right? And and of course you have to pay attention to that. You can't just say, I don't care. It's going to take 6 months longer because we want to continue to play with it until we're very comfortable that it's just right. That would be a real luxury. So you have to figure out how to do these things within a way that's not going to create these challenges in delivery. But that said, I think what I really always emphasize with our clients and relationships is back to this idea of what are you saying to someone, right? What when in terms of what this product is and how it looks and what color it is, and color, which don't get me started on, is a really challenging thing. Right? The problem with color is everyone has an opinion on color, regardless. But again, back to your questions, we're always trying to build the idea with the people we work with is, all this stuff matters, right? It all matters, and you just need to look at yourself and your own history with things of, what matters. And one of the biggest challenges in product design, in delivery, right? I mentioned this 90% perspiration phase is, what I like to refer. It's not my. I wish I'd made up this, but it's really accurate. Is the death of 1,000 cuts, right? When you're moving something through this process and you make all these micro compromises about it along the way, they add up, and eventually you end up with something which is not at all what you intended to have, right? Because of constraints, because of timing, because of money, because of all these very important things, but you're constantly, stepping back or pulling back to be able to be safe. You end up with mediocrity, right? So that's why we a lot of times say, look, I know you don't get it. I know this is going to take some extra time and extra sweat, but all of this stuff adds up, right? And not everybody will agree with that, and not everybody will. But the more enlightened, trusting relationships we have, we will. And then we take it on ourselves to be as responsible as we can, and work our asses off to make sure we still are able to deliver this thing and the time, the framework that it needs to. Sometimes you have to say, look, if we spend an extra 50 cents here, it's going to create all this value. So we have to go out and look at that boundary condition and say, is that really something we should be not? Is that something we should do? Right? Because it may end up being really important. Right? But it's I mean, one of the things I rail on about a lot is this idea of mediocrity, and it's this sort of notion of that good enough is a badge of honor, and that avoiding failure is the same as succeeding, right? It's and that's a lie, right? It's something that it can just completely derail something really great from making out in the world. That when people fall into this trap of good enough and I'm fine with fine, right? And it costs an enormous amount. So it's sometimes, I'll end up sounding a little bit like a preacher or a counselor or a psychiatrist, but it's, it's a really important thing. It's, these, I've been working on a book, the second book, that's called Making Great. And it's because I realized, we do a lot of work. Almost all our work's good, right? There's a smaller percentage that turns out to be great. And when I say great, it's actually, it moves the needle. It changes culture. It creates a new market. It does something, that is just exponentially beyond what's been done before. And when I go back and look at why did that happen, there is always this form of leadership, right, involved in the people they're working with that literally won't settle for anything less, and sort of will not accept mediocrity and continue to move something through the system with the idea of what it needs to be and how it needs to be. So that's for me one of the most important things. And when I start trying to contextualize these little things that seem outrageous, is sort of what these are the things you need to do to make something great. And if you just step back and look at the things you experience in your life that you would define as great, you'll see they're there. So trust us. Not everybody trusts you, but sometimes it does come down to that.
I think it's also interesting. I mean, what you said there that I think is often missing from this in the conversation with when creative people are engaging with clients is there's you said there's a level of responsibility. So I assume the responsibility of meeting your time and your budget and these are important things, and I acknowledge that they're important. But I can also question the price point based on these reasons. Like, I'm not just doing it because I'm lazy and want to include all the features and all the bells and whistles. I think it's important because if we switch from this material to that material, the cost goes up, but we believe the desire of the object will increase at a larger kind of gain than what you've sort of invested in it for the following reasons. And I think if you have that responsibility, it can be easier to convince people who might not understand, and if they could understand, they probably wouldn't need you. They'd be designing this thing themselves. That's why they've come to leverage your kind of skill. So I enjoy kind of hearing that, because that is something that we try and champion is that those details do matter. And if it looks bad, it's not good. It's like, it's easy to slip by, but then, like you say, if it happens on 20 touch points, suddenly that's who you are. That's, that is the entire perception that you've created.
Yeah. And I think, when you're in those relationships, one of the ways you do build trust is showing that you do actually are very cognizant of the impact of what you're doing. Right. And you understand that what it's going to take. And I mean, I had a couple experiences that helped shape that for me. One was just being within the corporation. I mean, the time I spent at Apple, and one of the things that always really impacted me, because going from a consulting situation, which I had my entire career beforehand, is the people that are putting their jobs on the line, literally, right? Literally putting, we used to say, putting your badge on the table, which means, I'm risking my job here, right, to do this, right? And so you see that, and you start to take very seriously, how you're pushing people. It doesn't mean you don't do it, but just really understand that it's very serious business. And the second was that we started Ammunition. We, had this sort of epiphany about how we work, our business models, and that, we were happy to get a job, and if we could get a good portfolio piece and get paid and pay our people, then it was a success, right? And then you'd see this thing you created go out in the world and create hundreds of millions of dollars of value, right, based on your intellectual property that you created. And we started to look at it differently. So we started to, with the startups we're working with, literally to invest in them. And, with the hopes that, this value that we create would go somewhere and create something amazing. And then sometimes it did. But there was a really interesting side effect of it, which was the mutual respect that developed between our team and the team that we were working with, and in the fact that, that we were investing, putting our money on the line, and that caused them to take what we were saying more seriously, and it caused us to look at the work seriously, which we normally did, but even further, like, okay, what can I do to make this thing successful, right? What can I do to really, help this business to be successful? And so that sort of created this interesting dynamic for us. So it doesn't inhibit us from pushing. It makes us very cognizant of the impact, and that's what creates that trust, right? And that becomes very important when you're pushing people. Again, if this product tanks, we'll go on to the next project. The founders of the company, may be losing an enormous amount of money and taking a huge hit to their reputation and so forth. So I think if people understand you're with them, right, then you gain so much more out of that relationship.
I love that. I always try to talk about standing on the same side of the table as your client, because so often, especially in the sort of the branding, design, advertising world, it's almost adversarial. You're sort of
Yeah,
standing on the opposite side, trying to get as much money as possible, and they're trying to hold back as much money as possible, and you're not kind of working,
yeah,
together. But when you sort of, if you can find a way of assuming kind of risk with them, it changes the dynamic completely, because you're like, I'm
yeah.
not as invested as you, but I'm now more invested than just paying a contractor to execute something. Like I have something to gain in the success of this, and therefore I will fight for things that I do believe will allow it to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's this notion of risk is really interesting that I deal with all the time, and especially again, I mentioned the sort of cost and complexity of developing physical products, and so what happens is people become very adverse to risk, right? And there's really risk mitigation is practiced, and the challenge is that I often like to say one of my favorite phrases I've coined is risk is not a four-letter word, right? Because it's it's directly tied to innovation, right? You cannot innovate without risk, right? And so again, people get very concerned about the potential of failure and or the or dealing with unknowns. You're doing something that hasn't been done before. Yeah, there's a lot of unknowns. It's a lot easier to go back on things that we've done before because we've done it before and we know what happens, so we can predict what will happen and everything will be fine. But then you're not innovating. So it is many times just really again trying to get across the idea that you should not fear risk. It should not be something that makes you afraid, and if it does, you should face that fear and understand it. Because if you're not willing to take a risk, then you're not going to be able to go beyond what you've done before and what others have done before.
Mm.
And but it's and again you're very cognizant of what the risk that the client is taking as opposed to you. But it really helps them understand that look, if we don't get our hands around this, we're not going to be able to move to that place where you want to, because you'll just be doing a nicer version of what you've done before. And maybe you're right
Mm.
with that, but I don't think that's why you hired us.
Mm. I'm interested. I mean, I think you said it earlier, is this idea of a few of your products become great, and that you write
Mhm.
in this book. If you distilled that down to a few things, what do you think are the kind of pieces that make something great, or the mix of things?
Yeah, there is. There's one, that I mean, there's a number of things, right? That when you start to look at what breaks that down, how you break that down. But one of them is, you know, what I'll refer to as a non-negotiable purpose, right? And it's something that's really important, but that there is something that needs to be done here that many times sits above financial, right? There's a product that needs to happen, and we believe that it needs to happen, and it's non-negotiable, and that you have this purpose. Like when we did our work for Square, this non-negotiable purpose was this idea of the democratization of credit card payments, right? That everyone in every business should have the ease of accessing the use of credit transactions in their business, right? That is non-negotiable. So we're going to make that happen. We're going to figure out how to do that, right? It's always there, and it's something that again that doesn't not everyone understands what that means, but we just sort of getting to something great. It's almost like you know what would you do or continue to do even if that's so important you do it even if you were punished for it, right? Is sort of how you get at that. Um, there's always this sort of clarity of direction. It may not be clarity in what the final thing is or final solution, but there's a belief that there's this direction we need to head, we're going to build it with focus and tenacity, and that's one of the things that um, when I look back at those projects that have come out great is this sort of idea of commitment and tenacity, right? It's just
Mm.
it takes a lot of work to do something right. And as we've been talking about, it's really easy to compromise or really easy to give up. But the things that many times make something great have people have that commitment and tenacity. Um, and and there's another one which it doesn't always get described this way, but it's I like it. And there's a belief in craftsmanship. Right? I wish there was a better gender neutral phrase for the craftspersonship. Always sounds weird, but it's really this sort of commitment to craft, and right that there is in fact a huge benefit in believing that you're going to do things right and deliver it in a way that feels crafted, right? And it's like this the difference in a piece of furniture you can tell that is that has been taking the care of an individual and so forth. And so it's kind of back to the we talked about earlier the sort of connection that people have with objects, and one of those connections that I think is really important is that when you feel connected to the person or people that created it for you. Right? Another thing about humans is we're always trying to connect with other humans, directly, indirectly. It's always something there. And so when you start to feel that connectivity of using a product, and it's like, wow, someone thought about this. Someone actually cared about my life when they were creating this thing, right? That is one of those that sort of differences that moves something from good to great. And it's actually one of the reasons when I get asked a lot about what the impact of AI is on design, I believe that design will always be a decidedly human pursuit because people are seeking out those human connections in the things that they acquire. And you can tell when it's not there.
Fascinating. So just to sort of summarize that, you're talking about this. There's like a purpose that this thing has to exist. There's a reason for being. There's a tenacity or a grit in sort of pursuing that and making it happen. There's a commitment to craft to make sure that it's high quality. And then the final piece is that there's a connection piece there, that there's a human to human touch that people can feel.
Yes. And back to Beats, when I first met Jimmy Iovine and Dre, one of the first things that we talked about the product that Dre said, and we put it on the box, literally because it was so good, was he said, people are not hearing my music. Right? And what he meant by that is that, the products out there, audio products, personal listening products, headphones, they were not tuned for the genre of music that he created. Right. So he said, they're not hearing what I intended. Right. And that was the sort of, the non-negotiable purpose, right? Is that I want to change that, right? I want to change that relationship, and then for Jimmy, it was similar. Again, there was a lot of excitement and belief about a business opportunity. There was literally no high performance audio brand for younger people that existed. It was just huge opportunity there. But for Jimmy, it was like really felt passionately about the connecting the audience with the artist, connecting the audience with the music, and feeling the emotion as it was intended, right? And so these were the things we talked about, not so much about, what the product's going to cost and how much it's going to make and the margins and it was all about these sort of, this sort of passion about connecting people with music and hearing it the way that was intended, right? And so that's, and so when you have that and you stay focused on that, right, inevitably it leads to a higher level of end result that's going to be impactful in the world.
I love that. I think it also gives you permission to experiment and push and do some of the things that you're saying, because there's a common language, a common point, a common something that that you said this to me and this is how I believe it to play out in the world, is a conversation that we can have, as opposed to, I think it should be metal, and they go, well, we can't afford metal, end of conversation. You're like,
Yeah. Yeah.
this is how it affects frequency. This is what it can do. This is, like now I believe it's going to, connect people to the music better. It gives it a different frame of reference that everyone can kind of speak to.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So Robert, I'm cognizant of time, so I'd like to ask you one more question, and it's probably going to be a difficult one for you to answer. But you create products all day long. In your, like, for you, like, what is the product that has that emotional space for you? What is the thing that gives you the understanding of purpose, the satisfaction of the craft, and that kind of connection to human beings?
You mean the product that I use and experience
Yes, the
that
one
has
that
those
you
qualities?
use and experience. You don't necessarily have to have
Yeah, I
created
know.
it.
Yeah, that is a really hard question, because it's largely because there's a lot. I think one of the reasons I'm in this and I do a good job at it is I tend to be a very visceral person and very sort of in touch with things and energies and so forth. So I mean, and I'm a car person, so I could easily. I mean, I do own I've had a number of Porsche 911s and just always been incredibly fascinated with the vehicle. And it's not just, as you said, there is certainly, there's a performance and there's a feel about it, but also the sort of history, right?
Mm.
And the thing about the 911 is it's this incredibly radical automotive platform. It's got the engine in the back, right? What the hell, right? But it's been committed to for generation after generation and largely unchanged in many ways. So there's so many things that I get through the satisfaction of experiencing that machine. But on the other hand, I also have an electric vehicle. I have an Audi RS e-tron GT, which is like a rocket ship, right? Literally. But I'm really appreciative of the not just the performance and the look of the vehicle, which are all great, but the attention to detail and attention to experience and attention to audio and attention to tactility and all those things that I've talked about that come through. I think my favorite object, though, that I own, which was, again, it was one that was really inspirational for me when I first began industrial design, was the TZO lamp by Richard Sapper, which is a classic design icon. But for me, it is one of those things where form and function and sculpture and everything about it are so intertwined, right? There is no sort of separation of this beautiful piece of sculpture from how it works and what it does.
Mm.
And and so I've had a couple of these lamps for, God, I don't even know how long, decades and decades, and I never cease enjoying them. And that's so for me, that's always an incredible mark of a product when you can have something for probably I mean maybe 40 years, 35 or 40 years, and still almost every day look at it and say this is amazing, right? So I think that those are a few things that I experienced. But there's a lot of them. Like someone asked me that once, and I was in the middle of doing some remodeling work. And I said, the Milwaukee Sawzall. And I don't know if do you know what a Sawzall is?
Yeah. It's got the little
Yeah,
blade
it'll
that
cut.
shoots in the saw.
Yeah. It'll cut through anything, right? And it's like, it's such a really specific tool, and it's ugly, but it does its job so well. That I can never, I'm working on something, I got to cut through that. I'll get out the Sawzall, no problem. And so I appreciate things like that have just been so purpose driven and it does it just so right that it literally cannot be beat. It's just, those things are fantastic.
I enjoy that. I have an irrational love for the spork.
Oh yeah.
So, it's this spoon, fork, knife, all in one. It's like it makes me happy on so many levels, and it doesn't necessarily do any of the jobs even particularly well, but it does all three of them. And it's funny to
Yeah.
see because I camp with my son. I've got a 6-year-old, and I've managed to transfer my irrational love of the spork onto him. So now when we go camping, he only wants to eat with the spork. Like that's the first thing that he wants to get it. Now, actually, I can't tell. I think it's part the name, but I also love that this ridiculous object exists, and there's a world in which you can just take this one object with you, and that's all you need to carry around with you to do all of your kind of eating.
And you only have to wash one of them, right? So,
Yes,
there you
I
go.
love that.
Exactly.
I love that.
All right. Fantastic.
Well, Robert, I mean, thank you so much for sharing your stories and your passion and the good fight of keeping mediocrity at bay, and championing that. So it was really good to chat with you. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, me too. I really enjoyed it, Ross. Thank you.
Awesome. And we'll catch all of you in the next one. Bye-bye.